Hello and welcome to the Adoption and Fostering Journal podcast. It is time for another episode. My name is Dr. Dennis Golm and I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Adoption and Fostering. It is my absolute pleasure to record today's episode with not one but two fantastic guests. We have Dr. Stacey Rose O'Sullivan Hayes and N. Horne. Stacey authored the article, A Heavyweight Yet Empowering Grandparent Special Guardians Lived Experiences of the Role and Family Dynamics and Interpretative Phenomenological Analysis. I should have just said IPA. If you're interested in the article, it has been published in our December issue, which is volume 47 and issue 4 of 2023. And if you're a member, you can access the journal and all podcast episodes via our resource webpage. And my other lovely guest today is N. Horne, who's CoramBAAF's Kinship Care Consultant. Welcome both. It's lovely to have you here. I thought if we could just start that you both introduce yourself to So, N, what is a kinship care consultant?
Hi. Yes, so I am a social worker by trade. I qualified as a social worker in 2002. I have a background in safeguarding social work, and then I moved into kinship care social work about 16 years ago. So for 14 years, I worked in a kinship care team in a local authority, initially as a senior social worker, and then practice manager and then team manager. So it was a specialist kinship care team. So we did the whole range of kinship care work. So we did consultations and advice on initial viability assessments. We assessed prospective kinship carers. We approved kinship foster carers. We supervised and supported kinship foster carers, and we provided support to special guardians and kinship carers with child arrangement orders. And we had quite a comprehensive support package, which is quite unusual, I think, still, or certainly at the time in the kinship landscape. There's quite a postcode lottery of kinship support that's available. So we did provide quite a comprehensive support package of training, support groups, support service, allocated social work support. And so after managing that service for 7 years, I left and became the kinship consultant at CoramBAAF, which involves generally kind of promoting sort of and exploring what good practice is in the kinship world, thinking and trying to influence policy, writing training materials, writing books, kind of facilitating sort of professional forums for practitioners working in kinship social work. And generally kind of exploring and being interested in all things kinship care, really. So I job share with my partner, Claire Seth.
And I was wondering, maybe for our listeners, I mean, they might know, but some might not. Could you maybe just in a couple of sentences just explain what is a kinship carer and how does it differ from a special guardian?
Yeah, so I mean, that's an interesting question in that the National Kinship Strategy, actually, that was published in December, they published for the first time a government definition of kinship care, and kinship care therefore being defined as anybody who cares for a child, a relative or close family or friend who cares for a child when they can't be cared for by their parents. And that includes informal and formal kinship care. And special guardians are one type of kinship carer. So they're kinship carers who have a formal legal order, a special guardianship order that the court has awarded them that gives them parental responsibility to care for a child. So that's, a special guardian essentially is just one type of kinship carer.
So, Stacey, tell us all about you, but in a couple of sentences. So, who are you, where do you work, and what inspired you to this article?
Okay, so I'm Stacey. I'm a clinical psychologist. I currently work in a CAMHS early years service, so that's with children up to 4 years old and their families. I've not long completed my training, so I qualified in 2022, so still very much settling into qualified life. And I completed this study that we're talking about today as part of my clinical psychology doctorate training. In terms of motivation, so this was very much came from personal experience in terms of me wanting to explore the experiences of special guardianships further. So a member of my family is a special guardian, and I was struck by some of the challenges that they've navigated often in the absence of support. So that kind of triggered me to explore a little bit further, to see what research was out there that focused on special guardians specifically, though what became clear was that there were quite few research studies that focused on that. And I wanted to provide an opportunity for special guardianships to share their lived experiences. So in particular, what were their experiences of family relationships in the context of the special guardianship order, and how they experienced their role as a special guardian. So that's me in a nutshell.
And also, can I say, I'm so happy that we're recording a podcast with someone newly qualified who's an early career researcher, because we are actively trying to promote submissions from early career researchers. So if you're an early career researcher, please do submit your work to our journal. We're very happy to promote it for you. And then you can talk to us on a podcast, just like Stacey. Maybe before we get into questions, can you maybe just briefly summarize what your main findings were before we get into the kind of nitty-gritty?
Absolutely. So in total, there were 5 main themes that emerged from the data. So I conducted interviews with the special guardians. So I'll give a brief summary of each. So one of the themes were called A Heavyweight Yet Empowering. And this was very much the sense that having a special guardianship order enabled and empowered the participants in the study to feel that they could make a positive difference to their grandchild's life, as the order gave them authority and agency due to having that parental responsibility, though taking on the role didn't diminish the emotional weight of supporting the trauma that was experienced by their grandchildren whilst with birth parents. So whilst being a special guardian could be empowering, it also came with the weight of responsibility in navigating the early experiences of the child. The next theme was from grandparent to parent. So participants in this study were all grandmothers, and the role of being a special guardian appeared to deviate them from their expected life trajectories and their expectations and hopes of grandparenting. Participants often reflected on the sense of being a parent more than a grandparent by being a special guardian. So this theme is very much about kind of participants' identities and their expectations, and the shifts that have happened due to being a special guardian. The next theme was a very wide ripple of effect, and this was very much around the wide-reaching impact being a special guardian had on the whole family unit. And there was a sense that becoming and being a special guardian didn't just impact the special guardian, the birth parents and the grandchild, so those who are typically within kind of the special guardianship order and arrangement. The impact was family-wide, and there was a sense that the decision that the special guardian made very much impacted family dynamics and the relationships within the family. There was also the theme emotionally battered. So this very much centred on the emotional experiences that participants had endured during their time as a special guardian, and the experiences were often triggered by their own internal struggles and through interactions with family members. So feelings of inadequacy, feeling blamed, divided loyalties, they were things that were acknowledged and came up for a lot of the participants. And the last theme was an impossible position. So this was very much around the experiences of contact and often not knowing what to do in the best interests of the child. There was a focus on seeing negative consequences in the child through contact being facilitated, but that's still being encouraged by local authorities to continue that connection with birth parents. And there was a sense that there was a lack of practical and financial support that exacerbated these struggles. So that's kind of the themes and the main findings in a nutshell.
And how many did you interview? How many grandparents?
Oh, I believe it was 6.
Thank you. And you can't see, but I'm now looking at Anne, who's bursting to ask you some questions.
I mean, I guess when I first read your article, Stacey, I mean, I think what just really struck me was that the themes that you'd identified just really resonated for me, essentially, in terms of my practice experience, really, with the work that I've done with special guardians and kinship carers. And I was just wondering how you arrived at those six themes. And was it easy to kind of arrive at them, or, was it a kind of was there a struggle to kind of identify what your themes were?
That's a really good question. I think there was, a lot of the experiences that came up for the participants, there seemed to be a lot of similarities. So I think a lot of the themes seemed to just quite naturally emerge because whilst they weren't necessarily the exact same experiences, the sense of the challenges, the impact to the family, contact experiences, they all seemed to mirror a lot of kind of the underlying struggles. So it wasn't too difficult, but there was so much data because, as you can appreciate, these special guardians had so much to share with me around their experiences. And it was very much around, and I think it's reflected in each theme, around just some of the areas of difficulty in particular and the impact that being a special guardian has had on themselves, on kind of their own circumstances, and also relationships in the family. So there wasn't a lot of divergence really in terms of their experiences. So again, I think that's something that very much struck me, just how similar their experiences were.
And I think that's, in terms of that sort of resonating with me, it did sort of really resonate that these themes were things that I'd familiarly sort of heard from kinship carers that I'd worked with, certainly. So maybe if we picked up on, like, a couple of them sort of in particular,
Mm-hmm.
I was struck by the heavyweight yet empowering theme.
Mm-hmm.
I was interested to hear a bit more about what were some of the burdens that they felt and their sort of sense of feelings of guilt, and what it was that had enabled perhaps some of those burdens to become empowering as well as being a burden, or what switched them from being a burden to being an empowering.
Absolutely. So, in terms of considering a heavy weight, that's very much around the emotional weight experienced by the participants in becoming special guardians. And I think one of the kind of burdens, like you say, in the weight was around their own child being involved in some of their grandchild's experience and trauma, and how that could be very difficult to comprehend and accept for the special guardian, and almost feeling a responsibility to make a change, and to try and facilitate kind of positive developments for the child and positive experiences. There was also just having that knowledge of the trauma, so having the knowledge of their own grandchild's early experiences could be quite distressing, and often they were carrying that knowledge without sometimes having the opportunity to process that. So they were trying to support and navigate special guardianship in the absence of that support. And I suppose that kind of links into the sense of duty that all participants felt, kind of a sense of being duty bound to support their grandchildren when their birth parents might not be able to. So it was very much that emotional weight of feeling responsible, feeling that maybe they could try and instill some change. And I think the sense of empowerment very much came from having a special guardianship order in place, because without it, there was a sense of kind of limbo, of a lack of power, of a lack of agency to be able to implement some of the change with the grandchildren. So having that in place created a sense of, I think all participants spoke about that sense of security and permanency that the special guardianship order kind of helped to put in place. And they very much had an increase in having decisions and regarding the child. So I think they very much felt empowered through having that order, but it didn't still take away from all those kind of difficult experiences and the impact that had on their emotions.
Which is interesting when we think about a broader range of kinship carers, because not all kinship carers do have the legal permanence that a
Mm-hmm.
guardianship order affords them. And I think it's interesting. It would be interesting to explore that with some informal kinship carers,
Mm-hmm.
whether or not the absence of the legal PR leaves them feeling disempowered because they can't therefore exercise. So whilst they might be providing some emotional security and the kind of emotional permanence and stability of care, without that kind of legal order, whether or not that, leaves them feeling disempowered.
Mm-hmm.
I really enjoyed sort of reading Katie's description, I think, who you referred to in your article, where she she describes how her grandchild calls her my mummy Nana.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed that that kind of description. And I was thinking back when I was a social worker and I was working with kinship carers directly, when I was still assessing kinship carers, I would try and explore the notion of that kind of changing role, kind of moving from grandparent to parent, and also and trying to kind of in some way prepare kinship carers for that change in role and that change in the emotional relationship, but also kind of trying when I was continuing to support kinship carers, to allow them to have a space to continue to kind of reflect on that and to think about how that changing role and having that sort of dual being a mummy nana, what that feels like. Because I think there's loss within that as well as gains.
Absolutely.
I suppose I was just interested in what some of your participants' experiences were of that and whether or not they were ever afforded opportunities really to reflect on that, because I think being able to reflect on it and process some of that is also key to doing it, to be having that change. So I was just, interested really in any participants' experiences of that.
No, I completely agree, Anne, and I think it's so positive to hear that you've been able to provide that opportunity to special guardians, kinship carers, because it's so important, because like you say, that sense of loss, change, the transition in role, and how it can shift from feeling very much parent, 1 minute grandparent, the next, and almost being on that shifting ground of identity. In thinking of the participants in this study, unfortunately, they weren't kind of afforded that space. That wasn't something that they had around them, and they kind of often had to navigate their role and that relationship with their grandchild of, that my mummy nana, without the support around them to explore that and reflect on how that feels for them and their emotional experience. And I think just to think about all the themes, there's very much a sense of the focus not often being on the special guardian with regard to the changes that they themselves experience through becoming a special guardian. So the changes to themselves, their circumstances, their relationships. So it often means that their experiences aren't shared, validated, or kind of empathised with others. And there's just a sense that space to process those changes is very limited, and quite lacking. But I absolutely agree. I think it's something that would be so helpful to have that space to be able to explore, their emotional experience, because it's a huge shift for them in lots of different ways. And for that not to be acknowledged, it feels like a real shame. And then you wonder the impact that then has for the special guardian, but also for the other relationships around them.
And also I've often sort of wondered on the extent to which we kind of give permission, which I know has become a bit of a cliched phrase, but to kinship carers to have those different emotions as well, because actually I think sometimes there's an expectation that, kinship carers, it's a straightforward decision and therefore their emotions that go with it will be relatively straightforward. I want to care for a child I know and love, who needs to be safer. But actually, there is often some mixed feelings. There can be a sense of loss, and and of transition, and the extent to which it would be more helpful if we could acknowledge that there will likely to be the whole range. I just wondered what you thought about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, before becoming a special guardian, that these participants, they wouldn't know how it was going to impact on them. They wouldn't know what might come up relationally with their grandchild and how that might feel. So just to have the space for it to be a possibility for that to be further explored, if helpful, for any special guardian, I think would just be so valuable, because like you say, it might be something that a special guardian might go in with a very certain set of ideas and expectations of how it might be and how it might feel. But actually, once they're in that role, it may be very different. And I think just having that kind of protective, safe space to process some of those changes would be really helpful.
It's hard, isn't it? Because, when you're, especially because it was all grandparents, wasn't it? So, and then having to care for, how old were the children they had to care for, roughly, do you know?
Oh, they varied in age. It was, a lot on the kind of younger spectrum. But I think even within that, some of the participants were caring for multiple grandchildren, and that will obviously add another layer to their experiences and the complexities as well. So there's an awful lot for them to be processing and navigating.
Also, at an age we're not expecting having to care for
Yeah.
well, neither a young child nor a teenager, right? So just think, because I mean, it's hard, isn't it? I mean, it's hard for parents who are young and fit, and then being thrown into that role again, probably, right? But when you're kind of at a much later stage in your life.
Yeah, absolutely. And that links into one of the other themes in terms of just the life trajectory kind of diverting from where they were expecting to be at a certain stage in their life and all the things that come with that. And like you say, it's a huge change. And I think one of the participants makes a kind of joke about not necessarily getting invited to as many things anymore with her friends, because I think she says, they've done their children, so they're not expecting me to kind of rock up with a grandchild. They're doing their thing, and just that sense of sometimes that isolation and the reduction in their kind of social connections through being a special guardian.
With that regard, I know I used this term when I emailed you, and I thought, because in the theory of latent vulnerability that Eamon McCrory and team are promoting a lot, which just explains how children develop mental health problems following trauma, basically. They also, in your articles, they use the word social thinning later on with regard to kind of children who've kind of, in that case, adapted to the, or show maybe some behaviors that have some negative effects on their surroundings or their peers, and then they lose friends, and basically through that they lose a vital support network, right, and resources. But I thought the term also fits with regard to the themes you describe in your article with the kinship carer, also because that's also social thinning, isn't it, that you're throwing into a different role and suddenly your friends might not quite know what to do with you. You don't get invited because they are now at the stage where they can party again and can do non-child related things, right? And you're excluded, and that doesn't even have to be because they are not meaning well, or or they want to exclude people, but just maybe it happens through the role you were put into.
And I think with thinking about that social thinning, it can be quite isolating for the special guardians to, like you say, have that reduction in social connections, whether it's themselves, whether it's their grandchild, and being quite saddened that their expectations for this stage in their life maybe haven't come to fruition. So, it impacts a lot of different areas of the special guardians.
You don't want to be the one making the rules at this stage, right? You want to spoil your...
Absolutely. And again, it's that shifting ground, isn't it, between very much feeling that special guardianship aligns more with the parenting role and maybe losing some of those features of being a grandparent at times. And again, participants speak about that and feeling quite saddened about that, because, their expectations of what grandmothering was going to be, wasn't what has come to pass, and that sense of loss again, that whilst they're still fundamentally a grandma, the role that they have in supporting their grandchild makes them feel very much more a parent.
Sounds a bit like a grieving process in a way.
Yeah. Mm.
I think there's a researcher, Paul McGrath. I'm not sure if you read his work. He talks about disenfranchised grief, I think, in his work with grandparents. It's exactly that. I think there is a sense of grief and loss that
Yeah.
I think isn't always named or acknowledged. And I think as well, I think some, kinship carers can feel perhaps a bit hesitant about expressing some of that side of it, particularly while they're involved in statutory, involved with statutory social workers, statutory social services, as in, they kind of, I think some are probably quite hesitant that perhaps, the child won't come to them if they're expressing perhaps some conflicted feelings about, actually,
Mm.
I've got, I wasn't expecting this. This isn't what I had hoped for. It doesn't mean to say they're not motivated to do it. It just means it can be both things, can't it? They can experience, loss, as well as be very motivated to want to care for a child. So I think it's complicated. And I think the ripple effect that you talk about that happens across the whole family.
Mm-hmm.
Did any of your carers, your participants, sort of what worked essentially for that ripple effect to kind of be accommodated or to be sort of absorbed, I guess? Was there any sort of interventions or support that helped, or what worked for them as a family, or was it more just a case of acknowledging the ripple effect, and that was powerful in itself?
Yeah, so I think for the participants in this study, so that kind of ripple effect and acknowledging that it's not just it's not just the special guardian, the birth parents and the grandchildren that might be impacted by the special guardianship order, but the wider family. I think they very much focused on feeling responsible for that and the weight that that had on themselves, but struggling to know what would help to support themselves and the family with that ripple effect. So they were often aware of the impact that it had. So thinking about other children being displaced in the home because they might need to leave the home in order to accommodate the grandchild being in that placement, and there being anger and sadness from other family members who may not have necessarily agreed with the special guardianship order being in place, and family, relationships prior to that, and there being maybe some conflicts already. I think there was a sense of being very aware of the impact that it's had, but not necessarily having any support to explore that, to navigate that. Participants did mention some things that they thought would be helpful. So thinking about having a family meeting early on. So, inviting wider family members to come to that meeting so that they can address any worries, any particular needs, and thinking about the strengths and resources that are within the family that might also be a resource to tap into, thinking about the direct impact to the family, but also what might some of the indirect impacts be to the change in family dynamics. Peer support. So again, there was very much a sense of each participant feeling very alone in their experience. So feeling that they weren't aware of anybody else who was a special guardian. It was very much just something that they were experiencing, and not having anybody else around them to kind of empathise with, that could put themselves in their shoes. That felt like something that could be quite helpful in just navigating that ripple effect. They also mentioned family therapy. So thinking about those who are likely to be impacted the most by the special guardianship order, and how to kind of nurture the relationships and to acknowledge if there's any ruptures within these relationships already that could be, helped to be explored and kind of strengthened. And again, I think a lot of the ripple effect, it very much came back to special guardians feeling solely responsible. So, it was my choice to become a special guardian. Therefore, I'm the reason that I've impacted on all these family members. There's very much a sense of it's for them to try and manage and navigate it with the family members. So even though there was a sense that this additional support could be really helpful, they felt that it kind of lied with them to try and ease relationships and, to consider why they'd taken on the role. But it's not for special guardians to kind of solely navigate their role at all. I think there's also a responsibility for local authorities to support them and their families. So they were kind of the main things coming out. And I think one last thing was around the value in having somebody who isn't a family member to support with the ripple effect. Because, special guardianship's very relational. You could be looking after a grandchild, a niece, a nephew, and just the sense of there being so many different relational dynamics within the family, and that real value in having professionals or just those outside of the family to navigate that would be quite helpful.
Just from an individual carer perspective, maybe, because I was thinking, like, when you have the kinship care special guardian, in that case, it obviously changes your relationship to your peers, right? It changes the relationship to maybe other children. It changes the relationship to your grandchild because you're taking on a different role.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm guessing also because of the kind of new authority you have, it will probably also change the relationship with your child who is the biological parent of the child who now lives with you, right?
Yeah.
But then, and then when you have that, what you just described, that feeling of being alone, and these other feelings of, disenfranchised grief, and all these feelings. And that is maybe also the difference to when you compare it to adoption, for instance, where you're where people make sure you have a social network around you that supports you, and where people make, you know, and where you're more prepared for taking on that role and you receive training. And so, right, so it's a different emotional, just from that individual carer perspective, I was wondering, it's a very different mindset if you're thrown into a situation, or when you're kind of actively preparing for, obviously, becoming the parent of that child in that case, and where people have made sure that you're an appropriate person to do so, and that also, which I know also happens obviously for kinship care, but where they make sure you have this support network around you, right? And that is sorry, just I don't have a particular question, but just when you were talking, I was just thinking, there's so much kind of throwing that kind of person's life into turmoil through all those different roles that are now changing.
Absolutely. And I think, like you say, when you think about putting the special guardian or the kinship carer at the centre of it and thinking about the impact to them, there's so much to it. And I think the fact that there are many special guardians and kinship carers who take on this role, without that support being in place, like you said, there's not that support, that social support, whether it's particular training, none of that is often in place before the role. And again, I suppose it's thinking about how much more positive could this experience potentially be for the special guardian and for the families if that was in place. Because, there are absolutely differences between adoption and special guardianship and kinship care. However, there's also huge overlap. So then it begs the question, why is there such a difference and a disparity with that support at times?
I mean, from a child perspective, right, it's absolutely fantastic that they can stay within their family and within their relatives and the people they know, right, and they know their grandparents and these. But obviously, we're talking about the carer perspective and their changing role, and kind of acknowledging that there are mixed feelings about that new role, and that's okay, right, to have these.
Everything that we've just been talking about, it just the phrase that I often use when I think about kinship care and is the epitome of unplanned parenthood, as in that's quite a helpful way of thinking about it, in that these aren't carers who have made a proactive planned decision. No, it's a time in my life I'd like to become a foster carer, or it's a time in my life I'd like to adopt a child. It's often something that happens in quite a crisis driven way, in an unplanned way, often at quite an emotionally fraught time. Obviously something very difficult's happening in your family that means that a child that you know and love needs to be cared for somewhere else, and that kind of needs to be the starting point really of the way that kinship care is thought about, really. And it's a very different context and starting point to how foster care or adoption arises. And I think that's crucial, going back to the things you were talking about, Stacey, in terms of service support and delivery, that it needs to kind of come from that starting point, really. And I agree that the children have often experienced the same trauma. And I notice, again, that was one of your themes as well, really, wasn't it, around people feeling ill-equipped to meet the needs of children who've experienced trauma. And in that respect, they are the same children often who are in foster care or who've been adopted. But sometimes the support isn't the same available support, unfortunately, for the children.
Absolutely. And I think that speaks to the experiences that came up with all the participants, in almost feeling like being a family member almost went against them in a sense. Like they felt like there was maybe the thoughts of, you're a family member, so that it will be fine, you'll have all the family support around you, and we're keeping those familial links. But like you say, what we've all just spoken about, there's so much complexity and so many layers that actually there needs to be more support thought about before, that the order is in place, just so that it's not only supporting the child and the birth parents and the wider family, but, the special guardian, that the individual who is doing everything they can to try and support the child or the children as best they can. Absolutely.
Hopefully the commitments made in the National Kinship Strategy that was published in December will have a positive impact on kinship families. That's obviously the department, it's the government's best hopes. And And there is some, there's some optimism, obviously, amongst professionals in the context of the kinship strategy, but there's still a lot to be done.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, just from your study, what is there to be done?
Oh, what is there to be done? Well, a lot, but I suppose it's very different because so many different offers are available in different areas of the country. It seems like there might be certain training or certain interventions that might be available in one area that might not be as readily available in others. So in terms of thinking about what could be done, just to, because there's lots of things that I could list off, but just to keep the participants' voices and experiences in mind, I think they very much spoke about what we've already touched on, so having a comprehensive support offer for all special guardians and kinship carers that might cover kind of life story work, so thinking about helping the child to understand their experiences, their identity, their own journey, support with facilitating contact, considering kind of trauma and attachment training, so the kinship carers or the special guardians feel well equipped to support their grandchildren, and that kind of systemic support around the family, and also opportunities for respite, because when we spoke about that kind of social thinning, there seemed to be a lack of opportunities for the special guardians to have some time for themselves and to kind of nurture their own well-being, their own interests. So that was also an area that was spoken about. And then thinking about just the kinship carer or the special guardian, so their psychological well-being, financial support, emotional support, practical support, because again, a special guardian can do their absolute best to ensure that they're doing whatever they can in those areas, but there's only so much that they can do without having that layer of support around them. As we've spoken about, there's a real strength and a benefit to having additional support around the special guardian, and just knowing that that's available in and of itself could be, quite helpful and quite positive and reassuring. And then also just thinking relationally. So considering that, like you said, and there are lots of different things around special guardianship in terms of the kind of the family dynamics and the complexities, and thinking about developmental trauma and all those things. And it's thinking about how supporting the family relationally may have a positive impact on the wide family. So talking about that ripple effect, it could have a very positive ripple effect for the family if that's in place. So I think they were some of the kind of key suggestions that came up for the participants.
But when you mentioned kind of training around attachment, training around trauma, because what came to mind is all local authorities do that for prospective adopters, right? So that is something that they are offering as a standard to certain parties, right? So because prospective adopters achieve training around these things. So is it safe to assume that it's not about the training existing, but the training being made available for kinship carers as well, maybe?
Yeah, I think access was definitely a main area of difficulty, because I think for many participants, they acknowledged and were very aware of what, foster carers, the support that they may get, or adoptive carers. So they were aware of the disparities themselves. So not only thinking of what that must be like as a special guardian to acknowledge that disparity, but also knowing that they are trainings and support that are available but not accessible for whatever reason it might be, is really tricky. And again, I think that then just further impacts on that sense of feeling ill-equipped to support a child, especially when we're considering trauma. But yeah, absolutely, there definitely seems to be a disparity, and the participants in this study were very aware of that.
I think it's coming from a different article that I read, also published in Adoption Fostering, if you're interested. But this was about experiences of foster carers who cared for unaccompanied minors, basically. And it was about also appreciating that it's quite different to traditional foster care, because there is a whole range of different experience that they are untrained for to deal with. And it came also up the importance of, if there are other experienced foster carers who care for unaccompanied minors, that it was so helpful to get in touch with those. So we're thinking if there's like other kinship carers, just to have like the importance of kind of shared experiences, just, or someone who really understands your situation, whether that would also be maybe something that could be helpful or valuable. It's just to see you're not alone in this situation and others.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it relates back to what we were talking about in terms of very much feeling that sense of feeling alone, and maybe just knowing that there are individuals, like you say, that have had similar experiences, may have tapped into some training that might be helpful for this special guardian to think about, or just being able to have the space to just talk about how things have been in the context of being a special guardian. I think would be very very valuable, because it just helps to kind of, I suppose, share some of the weight that we were talking about earlier.
I wonder, I'm just having a look at the time, given the time that we discussed quite a lot of things, even though I think we would have, lots and lots more questions, and it's a fantastic piece of work and so interesting. And I think there can be many, many follow-up studies. Maybe just to finish off, what's next? Is there next? Is there another study?
So there isn't another study in the works for me at the moment, but I would love to engage with further research in terms of special guardianship or kinship care, just to try and support policy and practice developments going forwards, but also to ensure that voices are being heard. Those who know best are those that have the lived experience. So nothing yet, but I am available for any research. I'd be happy to get involved with anything related to this, because it's an area I'm quite passionate about. But I would say at the moment I'm very much still settling into qualified life.
Thank you. Any final words then?
Yeah, I think just for me, just to touch on an area that we've kind of delved into a little bit, but not maybe had the space to consider in more detail, but just thinking about contact with birth parents, because that seemed to be an area that special guardians experience quite a lot of difficulty, but I think they very much wanted it to be a positive experience for all, but their experiences didn't kind of reflect that. And I think just to consider what they shared might be helpful to kind of consider, is thinking about evaluating the impact to the child and really considering, is contact in the child's best interests at this particular moment in time? Thinking about where the parents are at themselves, is it helpful for them to have contact at that time? And what do they need around them that might help contact be more meaningful and more of a positive experience for them? And kind of lastly, just thinking about the relationship. So if there are any ruptures or conflicts within the family, so with birth parents and, that their own parents are the special guardian, it's just thinking about helping special guardians to navigate that, so that there might be a lot of unresolved difficulties and conflict. But if they have that support in place to explore that, to process that, and maybe try and strengthen and nurture the relationships, then the hope is that would have a positive impact on the child, on the birth parents, and on the special guardians, so that hopefully it could be even more of a positive experience for them. So that's what I'll end on.
Thank you. And I was thinking we had actually an article on contact published with Judy Selvin was part of the author team. And if I remember correctly, one kind of big result was that a lot of the children are quite unhappy with the contract arrangements that are in place. Obviously, also shows that it's such an important topic to look into what contact arrangement might be ideal in work, and maybe also what you kind of hinted at, that this might change, right? So there might be a time point where different arrangements are needed, and then they need to be evaluated and change, as circumstances change and as children settle in. And
yeah, absolutely.
And any final words?
I so enjoyed reading it, Stacey, and obviously hearing from the from the kinship carer participants. Obviously, as a social worker, I'm always like, oh, I wish they had had more support, because I know that in some areas I think they would have had more support, and I think that's why it's also so almost doubly difficult sometimes to hear of of kinship carers who've received such a lack of support, knowing that it is available in some parts of the country. There's such a postcode lottery. It's such a shame, having worked in a local authority for a number of years, kind of managing a kinship social work team. I kind of feel quite passionate about the positive impact that the right support can have. I loved reading about your kinship carers and their experiences, but wished that they'd had the more support that they needed, really, and that everybody deserved. Thank you so much for the work.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. And I realised I should have said concluding or final remarks instead of final words. It sounded a bit quite final, didn't it? Well, it's been a long day. We are recording this podcast in the evening, and I am under-caffeinated. So yeah, thank you very much for being here. It was lovely chatting with you. And our listeners don't know this, but I'm going to press the button now that will end this recording, and then we're going to keep chatting, but without you listeners. So thank you very much.